when people think about microaggressions, they first go to what someone says to them or what someone does. And so you can think of, people touching your hair or commenting about your hair or saying that you are more aggressive or too assertive, things of that nature, right? A lot of people might get things like, where are you from? No, where are you really from? With this assumption that certainly you can't be from where I'm from. We're not from the same place. There's this element of foreignness to you. That's the easy stuff to talk about, even though those experiences are really, really challenging and hurtful and often linger, throughout our professional lives. What's harder to document, what's harder to evidence, but is nonetheless true, still damaging, still hurtful, are microaggressions that can show up a little bit more structurally, a little bit more culturally in the workplace. And so you can think about, Black women disproportionately having their judgment questioned more than others do, or having their contributions ignored, needing to provide more evidence of your competence than your white colleagues do, our white male colleagues specifically, being addressed in a less than professional way. I had a professor who told me, Black woman professor, who said that disproportionately her students of color will call her Professor X, Dr. X, and disproportionately her white students would just call her by her first name. We see this also happening in the workplace in different ways. I think there are other things too that are so critical. Every single work environment has, the office politics, right? And Black women disproportionately receive less support and less help in navigating those office politics. And if you get the office politics wrong, that could really be detrimental to your standing at that particular workplace, or it can be detrimental to your standing in the industry. Black women also have less access to senior leaders. And we know that currying favor with leadership can have huge advantages in the opportunities that you have, the sponsors and mentorship that you're able to have access to. And that can have a material impact on even how much you get paid. And so managers are also less likely to provide Black women with opportunities to promote their work, to showcase their work. And so that the harder stuff, right? But they're microaggressions, they're aggressions, they're slights on our professional growth and development as a result, our demographic identity. They're really damaging. There's this concept of issue fluency, right? Like we think about Black Lives Matter and the racial reckoning that's been happening, not just in the United States, but across the world, of thinking about the discrimination and racism specifically against Black people. And you see a lot of companies that are just donating or, making statements to things, but they don't actually know the issues. They don't actually know even how those issues show up, not just in their workplaces, but in the actual work that they do. I'll never forget that there was a White Coats for Black Lives rally that was happening across the country in the United States. And I'm not sure if they had them in the UK, but this stand against, police brutality and thinking about racism as a public health issue. And all of that was great. But where were they talking about how racism shows up in the healthcare system, like in your actual job, in your life? And as someone I know will get into this, who has deeply navigated the healthcare system after my cancer diagnosis, racism shows up as soon as the doctor walks in the door, right? Or even determining which doctor I get to go to. And so I think for businesses, regardless of your industry, and in this case, health, but regardless of your industry, you have to know how racism is actually showing up in your day-to-day, in the culture and in how you get to make decisions, and be honest about that. Like racism is a thing, right? I don't know if there's any way to contest that. Like it is a thing. And so let's be honest about its impact in how we do business and what our business is and how our businesses are impacting our communities and impacting our work. What I also see with businesses is that, you'll have your value statements, things that you believe in, things that you're committed to, but There's a barrier between the things that you say you believe in and how those values are actually impacting the decisions that you make, right? How can you allow your values and your knowledge about discrimination, about bias, about racism, what have you, impact how you do business? You know, you can't take a stand of we're committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, put it on your website, feel really good about it. But then when you look at the demographics of your company, all the folks of color have a much slower rate to promotion than your white employees do, right? Or you're not paying them equitably. Or with a lot of organizations, you'll see that they do have a lot of folks of color in their company, but they're pooling at the lower entry, lower paid, less senior levels of the company. Mm-hmm. How does your value for diversity, equity, inclusion actually help you change that dynamic? Great question. So first I want to start with defining imposter syndrome. And so imposter syndrome, it was originally coined as the imposter phenomenon in 1978. And what the researchers were observing were that even though women had inarguably all the accolades, you know, all the accomplishments, all the achievements, all of what anyone would determine as success, they were not internalizing that sense of success, right? They still feel like, you know, I don't belong here. I'm a fraud. Someone's going to find me out. I'm not that smart. There were examples of women who talked about, oh, the only reason I got in this competitive graduate program because there was a clerical error. You know, so this sense of like, even though all the evidence is there, you still don't feel it. You know, it's not internalized. And so what's interesting about imposter syndrome and how we've talked about it since, you know, 1978 is this thing that you're doing, right? Your lack of confidence, that there's something in your psyche that you just can't see how great you are, which is something we love to do to women and we love to do to women of color, especially. But I want to actually flip this and talk about like, how is imposter syndrome triggered in the workplace environment? And I think that links to a lot of the microaggressions we talked about. You know, a really great way to ensure that a woman in your workplace doesn't feel successful is to not pay her equitably, right? A really good way to make them feel like their contributions don't matter, that they're not good enough, that they're dumb, is to interrupt them constantly in meetings, right? You know, to take credit for their work or to hide their contributions in some way, you know, to not promote them, to not give them the same opportunities, to not invite them to the social hour where you get to meet this and that person in the industry that can have a real felt impact on your career. You know, that's a really great way to ensure that women, especially women of color, feel like they're stupid, that what they're doing doesn't matter, that they don't belong where they are. And so I think if we think about what's happening in the workplace environment, what's happening environmentally, we keep sending these signals to women, especially women of color. You don't belong here. You're not good enough. Whatever you're doing, work twice as hard because you have to keep up. Right? Or putting us in rooms where we are the only one or one of the few people there. Yeah, that's a really great way to make sure that someone feels that they don't belong there, is ensuring that they're the only one, right? And so what I have a huge issue with in how our culture talks about imposter syndrome is that we continue to put the responsibility for the solutions of that on the women themselves. And so for me, as a Black disabled woman, of all that I have to go through just to survive the work environment, now I have to fix it. Mm-hmm. I'm the one who has to tell you what's happening to me and give you solutions to address it. And not just for me, but for everyone else who's like me. That's a lot of work. And so my work and my position around imposter syndrome is to look at what business leaders, what company leaders, what people who actually make decisions, what are you doing, right? To temper or eliminate and end imposter syndrome and the feelings of imposter syndrome in the workplace? Yeah, so you can approach this two ways. I think the first way is to shifting your mindset around it. And so I personally have been most inspired by managers and leaders in my companies who actually wanted more for my career than I did, right? They were pushing for me to be at a level that I wasn't even imagining for myself, and then supported me along the way, right? Put my name in rooms that, no one else was elevating me or my work, mentoring me, sponsoring me, um, lending their social capital to me, which looks like, hey, have you heard about Jodi-Ann? You should meet with her. I feel like she could really be a great asset to your project in X, Y, and Z ways, right? Even just that association with someone who is a leader will have people look at me differently. I could imagine how many times there were probably conversations between folks that were like, I don't know, Jodi-Ann's on my team and she's just so contrarian, right? And to have a business leader step in and say, like, I love that. Every time I see that Jodi-Ann's on one of my project teams, I know that she's going to push us to have the best product. She's going to ask really good questions. Right. And so how can you advocate for folks? How can you elevate their name among your own peers? Right. How can you imagine more for them? And I've always been pushed that way. There are things that I've accomplished in my career that I don't know would have been possible if I didn't see someone who wanted that for me. Right. I got inspired by their vision for me. And so I think that's a mindset shift that can help build that confidence, help build that self-assurance among people, particularly women of color in the workplace. And I think there are material things, right? Like we have to be honest that there are very, very few people, there are some, but there are very few people who just go to work because it's fun, right? Like that they go to work as a hobby, No, they're going to work to be paid, right? They're going to work so they can financially support their lifestyle, their families, their futures, right? So how can you pay people, especially women of color? Pay inequity is like, it's so silly. It's so ridiculous that we're still doing that, underpaying women, especially women of color, for their work. Right. And so if you want people to feel confident, if you want them to feel assured in their job, you pay them equitably, right? You pay them well so they can just thrive in that work environment, so they can push, so they can be innovative because they're not, feeling undervalued. Even in this fantasy world where there's a void of bias, I still hold true that there are multiple authenticities, right? There are multiple authentic selves that I have. There are many ways that I can be. And in an environment that isn't biased, it means that I can call on those different parts of me in any given moment. I can be funny. I can be light. I can be flippant, right? But I can also be really, really serious and pointed and challenging. And all of those versions of me can exist in the same place without repercussion. Yes, and I like this framing of just supporting and talking about health generally, because I had a specific cancer experience. And it's weird because I don't know if I identify as a cancer survivor, because so much of my experience was about disability and what the cancer did to my body and how I'm different as a result. And I think not only is it really difficult for us to discuss health, particularly in professional settings or even in familial settings. I know so many families, mine included, that just doesn't talk about health, but to also talk about disability and normalizing disability and supporting disabled folks, people who move differently, think differently, what have you. And so talking about it, normalizing it, can actually save people's lives. right? If you don't feel like you're weird, if you don't feel embarrassed, because when it comes to health issues, there's so much shame. Even when I shared my diagnosis with people, there's this question around, well, why do you think that happened? What did you do? And there's a sense of, I caused my own tumor to develop in my spine. Like, I made this happen. If there's anything wrong with you health wise, then people think about, well, what did you eat? Did you exercise enough? There's something that you did to make this happen. And so people don't want to discuss it. Same thing with mental health, right? There's something wrong with you that you can't be tough enough, right? Um, we don't talk about mental health and depression and other mental illnesses. And it's happening everywhere, right? Everyone's experiencing some health issues some way or the other, or will at some point in their lives. And so I think normalizing and talking about it gives people the freedom from the stigma so they personally can seek help. And I think that talking about health, particularly for underrepresented groups, is just my part in trying to elevate how challenging the healthcare system and health environment can be for people who are different, and how that becomes this other like institutional barrier of who gets support, who gets help, and who gets to survive and who gets to thrive. Racism and inequity, it shows up in that too.